good evening, good afternoon, wherever in the world you are. So apparently nalaman natin na yung Spotify natin, we have listeners from like more than like 5 dozen countries actually, not more than 50 actually. So wherever in the world you are, thank you very much for joining us. Today we have a very special guest. I mean, all our guests are special, but in this case, it's special for two reasons. Because first of all, we're talking about a very old friend of ours, not old, but like friend from back in the day. Bata pa naman tayo. In fact, some of our books are still with me. Hindi naman kinupit, yung hiniram na hindi binalik. At nangyari din naman sa akin yan. So okay lang yan. Na karma rin. So some of my Gatsby and Hemingway and all actually sa kanya. Although I gave a copy of my Rumi, I think, to you. But the other reason is because we haven't had as much chance to talk about fiscal policy dito sa podcast natin, which I think is extremely, extremely important. So we have had economist guests. We talked about monetary policy. We talked about trade and industrial policy. Napag-usapan natin, obviously, foreign policy, which is very close to my heart. But yung isang malaking bagay para sa akin, no, to understand yung state of democracy of the Philippines or the state of besieged democracy in the Philippines is also to look at paano natin ginagastos yung buwis ng taong bayan, no? So obviously the Maharlika Fund will be our takeoff point today. At here, special guest Zyza, who is of course an advocate for fiscal transparency, and she's also a leading thought leader. Kasi maraming thought leader, but it's one thing to be a leading thought leader when it comes to raising awareness dun sa budgetary and fiscal issues in our country. And obviously, she has had experience both in the private sector, in the civil society, and also working in the government. So she's someone who really knows what she's talking about. Not to mention, she's also a very feisty spirit. I'm glad to know that, dumadami yung mga palaban na tao dyan. But obviously today we're not here for Bardagulan. We're here to have really some serious discussion about budget issues of Philippines. But obviously, Suzara, you want to go ahead and give our audience some idea about where you're coming from, what are your advocacies, bakit para sa'yo napakamahalaga itong issue ng budgetary transparency, and for average people, layman, understanding of these issues. And then let's start muna with Maharlika Fund, then go from there.
Yeah.
Please go ahead, yeah.
Sige. So for good evening sa mga listeners ni Richard. Actually, tagal kami magkakilala nito.
Of course.
Like more than a decade ago, no?
Right.
So more than a decade ago, we were classmates in UP, and like literally, kaming dalawa lang yung magkaklase.
Yeah, so sa grad school, di ba? Dalawa lang kayo.
Dalawa lang tayo, and the third person was the teacher. So anyway, so yeah, during that time, I think I was in government. I was in DT. Right. I was doing international trade policy, but then I left and then I shifted to DBM. So that's where I really learned about fiscal policy, fiscal operations, public financial management. And at that time, I was in government kasi there was also a strong push for citizen participation in budget processes. So good governance, yung centerpiece. And I really learned a lot from that, and that's at the core of my advocacy paglabas ka ng government. So marami kasi doon about makikialam sa national budget, how it's allocated. But syempre, in order to do that, kailangan naiintindihan natin ano yung mga fiscal oversight agencies, ano ba talaga yung fiscal policy, ano yung fiscal operation. So I'm glad that you invited me here. We've been planning this for the longest time, di ba? Pero wala kasi tayong mag-meet na schedule. So, yeah. So finally, yeah.
Suzara, of course, your background is in development studies, which means you have quite a parang kasi interdisciplinary yung approach mo, di ba? That's my understanding. Because a lot of us either pure economists, pure social scientists, pure public ad. But I think you were one of the people from development studies, so you had a comprehensive view. Like, were you excited when you entered the government? Like, what were your impressions about working in the government, and how did it turn out? Of course, we're talking about the 2010s when good governance, daan matuwid, ito yung mga discussion ng panahon na yan. Yeah.
And so when I entered government, and particularly in DBM, I had no idea myself. Ano ba ginagawa ng mga tao dito? Kasi for one, I had the impression that accountants yung mga nandoon, di ba? Kasi syempre, like, compute ka, evaluate ka ng financial report, financial proposals of different government agencies. But then when I finally came to understand the work and how it's very central to governance and the bureaucracy, doon ko naintindihan na, okay, so advantage actually na I was a development studies major. Kasi necessarily, when you talk about the budget, you go through one whole cycle of the budget process, and you talk about a lot of policy issues, from economic to fiscal to security, dadaanan mo lahat. So, ang joke namin na mga taga-DBM before is, if you go through one cycle of the budget process, from budget preparation until it's audited, you sit in and get involved in the whole of it. You actually kind of have a master's in public policy, kasi ganun karami the breadth of the issues and the depth of the discussion that go into budget hearings. At hindi lang ito yung sa hindi lang ito budget hearings sa Congress, sa House of Representatives or sa Senate. In the DBM itself, merong budget hearing. So later on yun, na-appreciate ko, and naisip ko, tama lang din pala na doon ako napunta, kasi at least the interdisciplinarity of my degree was very helpful to me.
Yeah, thank you for pointing that out. Yun nga kasi parang general your impression is pag DBM accountant. If I'm not mistaken, the current DBM chief has an accounting background. If I'm not mistaken, no?
I think she's an economist, actually.
She's an economist, yeah. So,
economist, yes.
Going back to the issue of DBM, obviously, the early 2000s were a fascinating moment to be in the DBM, in a sense that the fiscal space really expanded huge, So thanks dun sa some of the macroeconomic reforms na, let's be fair. So I think Tita Arroyo, like
pressure
by the US, etc. She did some reforms. So I think we could say from 2004 onwards, in fairness naman may mga bagay na maayos. And then when the late President Aquino, God bless his soul, came into picture, continued economic growth, continued yung best parts of the macroeconomic policy of Tita Arroyo in that sense. So we're just saying we're not here to make partisan statements. It's just a reality. So when you look at the fiscal space, no, yung laki ng budget natin, nag-triple yata within a decade or so, no? And much of that expansion really was during the Aquino year. So it's very hard to find any country in the world that had such a huge expansion. I mean, remember back in the day, I was looking at a trillion pesos budget. The next thing I know, there's a quadrupling of that. Like, as someone who was in Department of Budget Management, can you tell us the experience of being in charge of really a massively expanding pie? And what did that create? Excitement? Did that create worry? I'm saying that because this is also the time of Dan Matuwid, di ba? Parang mas maraming pera, pero mas ingat din yung gobyerno ngayon dun sa pera na ginagastos, di ba?
Yeah, sige. I will answer in Tagalog, ha, para mas maraming makasunod.
Paki-explain yan in layman language kasi kaya nga na-appreciate ko na ikaw yung guest namin because madali ma-intimidate dito sa numbers, unang-una. At pangalawa, sa issue ng fiscal policy. So, it's both economics and mathematics. Pero ikaw kasi perfect ka because you're not necessarily from an accounting economics background. Pero parang gets mo talaga yung issue. So, can you explain sa mga hindi rin economists yung background or accounting?
Yeah. Okay, so I entered DBM at the start of President Aquino's administration. So yun nga, I came from DTI before. So I was actually exposed to
DTI? I didn't know that. Sorry.
I was in DTI during the Arroyo administration. This was
Marv? Hindi naman Marto, no?
No, not Marv. This was
Peter
Pavillana. Peter Pavillana. And at that time, yung mainit na issue nun yung Japan-Philippines Economic Partnership Agreement. So ngayon, Philippines-Japan Economic. So I was part of that. Got exposed to a lot of economic policy decision making, got exposed to the entire bureaucracy. Kasi syempre, when you're negotiating an FTA or a free trade agreement, buong burokrasya yung involved doon. So personally, that was an advantage rin to me. Kasi when I entered DBM, hindi sa akin bago na I have to talk to so many different people from different departments. Essentially, yung buong burokrasya. Kasi ang client talaga ng DBM ay buong burokrasya. Plus the government corporations, plus the LGUs, plus nung meron pang PIDAF, pork barrel na pinapa-approve pa noon sa DBM, or even the legislator. So at the start of the Pinoy administration, mataas yung commitment talaga to reform the budget basically budget operations and fiscal policy. So that involved, ayun, syempre nung una parang, di ba, parang yung mga tao sama-sama na sa mga anti-corruption rhetoric. Pero kami na nasa loob ng DBM, sineryoso yon namin at saka ng mga tao sa bureaucracia. So that means trying to find out nasaan yung mga bottlenecks ng government agencies. Kasi the bottlenecks in government agencies are essentially causes of inefficiency. So kapag inefficient, ibig sabihin hindi nagagastos yung pera ng government. So maraming trabaho, maraming reforms around that area bukod doon sa pag-strengthen din ng capacity. Kasi the context that not many people not many folks friends in the media got to talk about during that time was the fact na nung pumasok yung administrasyon ni Pinoy, Daang Matuwid, ganyan. Tama yung sinabi mo maliit yung budget noon. Maliit yung budget, maliit yung capacity ng government to spend. And by capacity, I mean the warm bodies and the technical expertise of people to do procurement. Kaya dati naalala ko nung bago kami sa DBM, ang palaging excuse ng government agencies na didelay ang projects, hindi na i-implement, for example, construction ng roads, construction ng bridges, or whatever socio-economic project you have because of yung procurement law, and it had a lot to do with poor development planning and poor linkage of planning ng mga ahensya sa mga budget officers nila. So yun yung
So in circulation may problema talaga, may
Oh
clog.
yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean there are two things, no? Like one is procurement, another one is disbursement, kind of related, dalawa na yan. Like
yes.
On a very normal human level, like isa sa mga bagay na nakakairita is yung tipong bago mag-election biglang nagkakaroon ng daming road construction, etc. Kasi bawal na pagdating sa election. So you have a situation na matino yung aspalte mo, pero alam nila hindi na nila magastos next year yan.
Gagawin
na yung aspalte, lalagay nilang simento para lang gastos. So that's where people understand like the current legal structure actually creates very perverse spending patterns or infrastructure build-up. At the same time, ang bagal yung infrastructure build-up sometimes because of right-of-way issues, etc. So, can you explain that a little bit more na gaano ka malala yung problema na yan nung unang-una sa panahon ni Pangulong Aquino? Kasi daan mo to it, hindi lang pwede kasi malinis ka lang. Kailangan mo pa rin gumastos at tumulong sa taong bayan, including sa four-piece policy, etc.
So, nung pumasok kami, there were a lot of government agencies na number one, hindi sila makaspend ng funds. Either nagre-revert lang sa treasury because that's in the law. Kapag hindi nagastos ni government agency, babalik sa treasury yung funds. So, useless. Parang bakit ka pa ng budget, hindi naman nagawa yung project. And there were a lot of departments notorious during that time na mag-realign. Meaning, may pondo sila for X project, ililipat nila to Y project. So I mean, I can already anticipate maraming magsasabi that's DAP. No, I can explain DAP later. Pero yung
shortly after, we're pero dito muna tayo sa traditional practices.
So ayan, mga realign, and that's not a good practice. Why is that a bad practice. Kasi ibig sabihin, hindi na plano ni government agency ano yung gagawin niya talaga the project. And when government agencies keep shifting, keep realigning their funds, delayed rin yung procurement dyan. And so you had a regime, a budget regime that was operating in 2 years. Imbis na yung projects, binudget for 1 year, para matapos during that year, magsispill over siya to the next year. Yun yung yun yung kumbaga naging practice sa bureaucracia,
So
naging
medyo
tuloy.
sabog. I mean, to put it in layman,
Oh,
medyo
yes.
sabog talaga eh. So, hindi lang,
Oo.
yun nga eh, kasi ang tingin ng tao, problema lang corruption, which is like ninanakaw. Pero actually, ang dami rin nasasayang dahil hindi nagagastos or hindi na-allocate na mabuti
Yes.
or ang dami mga leakages dito sa pipelines.
Yes.
Hindi lang
Yes.
nakaw yung problema. Exactly. Yeah.
Yes. Kasi hindi lang siya yung corruption the way we know it, the way we perceive it na, alam mo yun, magpapad ng budget proposals. Ganyan, hindi lang yun yung mas mahirap na problema actually yung capacity ng burokrasya ng Pilipinas. And I always say this when I give talks about the budget.
Very good talk.
Isa kasi sa mga naging issue din dyan is hindi kasi din na-develop yung institutional capacity. Kasi if you remember during the Asian financial crisis, so syempre, mababa yung revenues, karon ng deficit din. President Arroyo's government was basically constrained to impose austerity measures. So part yan ang sinasabi mo na she was basically forced by other institutions.
Partners. Yeah, 2004
Yes,
yata lang nag-start di ba? So 1997, 1998, ito yung Asian financial crisis. In fact, if I'm correct me if I'm sorry if we digress, but I think this is important again to give context kasi we don't want this to be a partisan. He's bad that. Kasi things were kind of improving during Ramos in terms of tax collection, right?
Yes.
Like, tax effort was 15%. And then I think bumaksak siya sa 11 or 12% pa ni ERAP. So you can imagine how bad things were when Tita Arroyo took over, right? To be also fair to Tita Arroyo, di ba? So essentially we lost almost a decade there, like from 1997 all the way to 2004 and 5. And then nag-start pa lang tayo mag-ayos, di ba?
And we're just talking about the level of revenues that government can have. Ibang usapan pa yung institutional capacity. So because bumaba si revenues natin, nagkaroon ng Asian financial crisis, there was less opportunity for the bureaucracy to develop its institutions. And what happened was, because of the crisis, so nagkaroon ng tinatawag na rationalization program. I am sure if you have listeners here na nasa government during that time, you would know na freeze yung hiring, hindi pwedeng promote ng mga tao, hindi pwedeng mag-create ng bagong opisina. Basically, forestalled yung development ng institutional capacity mo.
So parang, kumbaga kung airlines, mamaya na ako mag-thank you sa Philippine Airlines by the way. Parang dumami yung flights mo, parang yung flight attendants mo, yung piloto mo, yung staff mo kulang, di ba? So even if mas marami kang budget to run things, kung kulang ka sa staff and personnel, magkakaroon ng implications yan eventually, di ba? Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so pumasok yung Aquino administration, ganun na. And then slowly, because the economy was growing, na nagkaroon ng reforms to plug the leakages, so kahit papano yung mga pera na sasayang na ma-maximize. But then you had that problem of institutional capacity. I-remember yung sinasabi kong planning pa lang and budgeting. Naku, notorious, maraming government agencies na gano'n.
So sorry to cut you. So pag sinabi mong institutional capacity, sinasabi mo kulang ng personnel, kulang ng mga sapat na batas para alam mo nang gagawin mo yung SOPs, kulang ng supervision. Essentially, yun ang ibig sabihin, di ba?
Yes.
Para lang magigets ng tao. Kasi syempre tayo sa ating policy lingo, we always use mga term institutionalization. Pero sa madaling salita, anong problema? So yung mga yun, di ba? Yung mga kulang ng staff, kulang ng supervision, etc. Yeah.
Yes. For example, just so it's less abstract for your listeners, yung procurement, di ba, sabi ko kanina, parang laging yun yung excuse. Laging yun yung alibi ng mga agencies. Pero sa isang banda, valid rin yung complaint nila eh. You know why? Because even if
Mm.
we had the Government Procurement Reform Act,
Right.
back early administration ni GMA, there were no permanent procurement units in government. It was all ad hoc. Meaning,
Oh, so parang
no,
medyo,
kunyari ikaw,
Yes,
analyst ka, ako
yeah.
analyst sa kabilang bureau. Part-time ng back, pero ad hoc. So it's on top of the regular job that we're doing. So
So walang clearinghouse na, 'di ba, eto pupunta dito diyan. Kanya-kanyang diskarte na yan, parang gano'n.
it's not that walang clearinghouse. It's more of
Shucks, ang sabog pala nung
it's
I mean,
more
kailangan natin pag-usapan, sabog talaga yung mga institution natin, 'di ba?
Oo,
Yun yung sinasabi
oo,
natin. Again,
oo,
mamaya na natin pag-usapan yung corruption mismo na talagang kinukuha yung pera. Eto
yes,
yung andun na nga yung pera, hindi natin alam gagawin natin kasi wala tayong sapat na kakayahan na i-disperse naman,
oo,
mag-procure tayong
yes,
projects. Yeah.
oo. So yan yung context. And then here comes the Aquino administration trying to implement a lot of socio-economic development
Secretary
projects.
Abad, no? Si Secretary Abad ang pinili niyang DBM, di ba? This time.
Yes.
Bakit? Because of his background in understanding governance, politics. Can you also explain what's your understanding of that? Yeah. Again, this is in a totally non-partisan fashion. Kaya we're just trying to be fair here because we're just trying to understand if this is so important for the president, we also want to understand the choices that he made. Was Secretary Abad the right person in your opinion?
Yes. Yes. I mean, of course, I would say yes, having worked with him for the longest time. Kasi Secretary Abad had experience in the bureaucracy. So he was, for a time, nung administration ni President Aquino, although it was the first President Aquino, although it was short-lived, he was actually DAR secretary. After that, sa administration ni GMA, ni President Arroyo, he was the DepEd secretary. He was actually the one who reformed DepEd from DEX. Yan. So, then DBM. And then aside from that also, he was a grassroots organizer, so civil society. Talagang involved siya dyan nung martial law years before he also entered politics. And of course, he was a legislator. So, yung background niya was very much fit for DBM given the breadth of experience and also the expertise. Kasi he also, well, kung pag-usapan natin yung pinag-aralan niya, well, he's a lawyer, he was a community organizer also, and he also has background in public financial management from
Right. Sa Ateneo?
Kennedy School, actually.
Sorry, I mean, just Harvard. Yeah, Harvard lang naman eh. Yeah. We have to say this. That's the point eh. Kasi puro na lang usapan, Dilawan, Arroyo, ganun. Like, it's four people who were running the show during this time. And ikaw kasi, you know this better than any one of us out there in terms of like, you have worked with these people, you have seen how they're working. I mean, I can vouch for you. I mean, you didn't enter government to make money for yourself and make life easier for you. No, you went government because you want to serve. I mean, I can vouch for you in that sense. Kaya if there's someone I want to ask, I'd rather ask you than whoever journalist or chismosong marites there, di ba? So, be totally non-apologetic. If you believe the person is the right person who was doing the right thing, go ahead, say it. No problem. This is a safe zone. Kung may magbash sa atin, kawawa sila sa atin. Like, yung supporters natin dito, kawawa yung mga troll sa page ko. Like, isang troll, 10 yung response na wala nang matira sa kanyang angkan. Yung like, it's horrible. Like, guys, let's be nice to be kind. All right, so don't worry, be completely unapologetic about this. And I'm trying to be fair, di ba? Like, ito yung reforms ni Arroyo, ito yung nakuha niya, ito yung nangyari sa So don't worry about it. Go ahead, yeah. Safe zone.
So, that was his background. So, kumbaga, kilala niya yung bureaucracia, kilala niya ang civil society, kilala niya how legislators work. And so, he had a very good idea of how to work with those different sectors of society. Talagang, and yun, he was also, because he's also a lawyer, kailangan mo sa DBM rin, lawyer, kasi batas yung, batas yung General Appropriations Act. And the General Appropriations Act is not just a bunch of numbers. Bawat section ng budget ng department, meron siyang mga special provisions, general provisions. And you know this from your time in ano.
Ako kasi, Suzara, for me, I was just suggesting talking to some friends, kailangan talaga ng legal education, anyone working, especially in the technocratic offices, like, for instance, Balisakan in Competition Commission, etc. You cannot just be economist. You have to understand ano yung batas para maintindihan mo paano ma-implement yung mga technocratic vision mo. So, but as I said, I appreciate the fact that Secretary Abad was not just another lawyer, because we have a lot of lawyers, but it's someone who also understands finance and public administration, which is very, very important. So thank you for pointing that out. Yeah, so you work for him, and then, like, what was the strategy, grand strategy, deal with this mess, right? And what transpired? Kasi papunta na tayo sa DAP, because I want to understand what was the logic behind DAP. Because my understanding, Secretary Abad wanted to deal with some big mess there to make governance more efficient, bring the services. And then where did it go wrong in terms of at least what the Supreme Court is saying? And then ano yung naging counter strategy after the DAP ruling by the Supreme Court? Go ahead, no apologies, explain the situation, because it's extremely misunderstood and unfortunately very politicized by
Yeah. So yeah, that was the context. Okay, yung kulang yung capacity. So therefore, hindi madali para sa mga government agencies, especially the infrastructure agencies, to implement projects. I'll give you the figures. For the longest time before the Aquino administration, infrastructure investment spending was 1% of GDP. The goal then was to grow it to 5% of GDP. It's not a matter of just pouring in funds. Kasi anong silbi ng funds kung hindi mo ma-implement, di ba? Paano mo ma-implement kung hindi ka marunong mag-procure? Paano ka marunong mag-procure kung wala kang procurement unit? So, those were the complicated problems within the bureaucracy, and you multiply that by X number of departments dealing with the same issues, you have underspending. And ano kasi, I remember that time, si Pinoy was very strict. Talagang pinipressure niya yung economic managers to deliver what they committed to deliver for that year. Halimbawa, si Sec RC Balisakan, si Sec Purisima, they said GDP growth for this particular quarter will be 3.5, sabihin natin, percent. Sisingilin niya yung cabinet secretaries ng 3.5%. Tatanungin niya a month or two before the GDP data gets released, where are we in this now? So of course, si Sec Abad,
economist kasi si Aquino. I mean, at least he took basic BA economics, diba? Under Tita Arroyo, again, among other people. So he knows what he's talking about, right? Hindi yung nag-attend lang sa Oxford tapos mamaya yan.
Or sino yan? Anyway, so yeah, so he was like that. He was very committed to the targets. He wasn't the kind na ito yung target natin, tapos merong external factor, sige, i-move na lang natin yung target natin, let's lower it. He wasn't like that. So talagang pressured yung economic managers to deliver. A lot of the pressure we had to absorb because we were DBM. We were the ones in a position to tell the agencies to spend. Kung hindi kayo mag-spend, patay yung GDP. Talagang ganon yung kami yung basically taskmaster ng buong government. So that was conceived because of that. And a lot of people
at the DAP. Yeah, disbursement acceleration program.
Acceleration. Hence the program name. It was, I remember it wasn't actually just Sec Abad. It was a discussion in the economic cluster. So talaga malaking siya. So parang they were talking about anong gagawin. Hindi mahahabol yung GDP target kasi the previous quarter ganito na tayo. Hindi mahahabol kasi. So at that time and it was constitutional naman to use saving. So at that time yun, magre-reallocate and magre-realign. But the parameters were very clear. A lot of people politicized it and said parang naging discretionary siya. No, the parameters were very clear. Ililipat lang natin yung pondo, number one, kung si government agency merong funds na i-offer because they can no longer spend it within the remaining months of the fiscal year. But pag nilipat natin, ililipat natin yan sa program ng ibang department na
Related.
not related but mabilis mag-disburse. Because the goal
Okay.
is
Bring
really
it to the more efficient. Okay, yeah.
The goal was really to disburse. So yun, so medyo complicated yung part dun sa yung sa constitutional issue, pero yeah, yung naging problem was this is what was in the Supreme Court ruling, yung
Prerogative of the Congress, the power of the purse. Parang I think
yes,
yung naging issue
yes,
dyan.
basically parang it
You're
impinges.
hijacking. Yeah, you're hijacking the power of the purse. That's my understanding of the Supreme Court ruling.
Yeah. But yung particular na dineclare nung Supreme Court na unconstitutional was yung transfer of funds from one constitutional office to another, because there was one transfer from the executive branch to COMELEC.
Right, which doesn't sound nice.
Doon admittedly sumabit yung and of course, yeah, syempre because of that, hindi lang naman yung mga yung mga cabinet officials yung demoralized about it. It was the entire bureaucracy kasi syempre people in DBM take responsibility for their actions, and talagang there's no room for errors kasi sa DBM. Kahit analyst ka lang, hindi talaga pwede yung yung sloppy yung work. Hindi pwedeng ganun talaga doon.
Kasi no room for it. Especially, I mean, because for cutting it, because the context also is PDAF, diba? The whole Napoles scandal. So these were really hypercharged, super sensitive political times. Kaya for me, leap of faith din yung ginawa ni Abadan, Secretary Abadan. I mean, I understand the necessity for it, but I think it was really a sensitive time. Now, the reason I'm saying that is because, again, we're not here to badmouth anyone, because this person might end up in the cabinet of BBM soon. Because Marojas, who was in the Department of Transportation back then, parang one criticism was kulang naman yung like clearing of the projects and all. Because I remember very well during the Aquino time, one of the big problems we had, which we raised dun sa 2014 World Economic Forum, no? And there was a Bloomberg Forum, I was a speaker, there was parang ang daming delay dun sa mga, so a lot of criticism was actually directed towards Marojas, na parang when he was in charge of transportation, parang halos wala nang, and my understanding is Marojas was a bit too careful, kasi yun nga ang daming kailangan linisin, ayusin bago to go all, and we'll connect that later on, because in my opinion, that came to haunt Aquino era and really paved the road for Duterte to come in. But the reason you're there because you're explaining yung conundrum and the dilemmas that you were facing, and the solution that you were trying to provide, it will be struck down also by the Supreme Court, no? And unfortunately, it's politicized, yeah.
So yeah, and then it just so happened na, well, it was really just coincidental, sa totoo lang, yung PDAF na when it when it came out in the media, parang it got so politicized, it got conflated with DAP when it had nothing to do with DAP. Parang yung naging messaging ay DAP is President Aquino's pork barrel, when in fact, kumpleto yung listahan ng DAP. Parang legislators, and I remember legislators from the left asked for the list of projects, and we were able to give the list of projects. We made it public, and parang yung laging sinasabi ng ng mga nakatrabaho ko sa institution is this is actually much better and more transparent, because in the past naabutan pa nila blanket authority lang, and it was literally Malacanang approving the projects kung saan pupunta. Wala nang technical vetting, kumbaga. Parang talagang itas.
Parang political appointee lang, diba? Like, gusto na Malacanang. Feel niya, gusto niya. So, short, you paid the price for creating modern institutions, or kind of a modern institutional arrangement that made you open to attacks. Ako naman, I mean, my understanding is, unfortunately, that's the downside of having a political, having a let's just call it what it was, like moral politic approach to governance, right? Because Aquino from day one until the last day of his governance kept on saying, "Dan matuwid, good governance." So I think that made his administration very vulnerable. Na kahit a whiff of, corruption or a whiff of suspicion of corruption could easily be politicized and essentially weaponized, no, against him. And I remember, well, I don't know, you tell me what's your reaction. I remember yung press conference ni Pinoy after the Supreme Court ruling na parang pinapagalitan pa niya yung Supreme Court. I think like parang nabwisit siya doon. And I think the understanding was like, nakikipopulist na yung Supreme Court na they were like trying to ride on this good government. But for me, like, well, that's what happens if that's what you do, right? Like, this is the problem. It comes back to haunt you in one way. I completely understand from a technical standpoint, this is not a pork bar, etc. But I understand also why very vulnerable to attack. Now, with the Supreme Court ruling, so ito na, DAP was struck down. So what was the fallback option?
So we had to discontinue it, and basically DBM had to legally scrub all the provisions related to use of savings, reallocation, realignment. Kasi during that time, and again, this might be technical, but it's a fact. Walang nuanced definition ng realignment, reallocation, use of savings. So it was all a lot. Let's put it this way, maraming rules sa DBM na hindi codified during that time.
So may gray zone, parang may legal zone.
Yes, maraming legal gray zones. There was no operations manual for the entire government. So ganon, kasi you have to remember also, ilang decades lang yun after EDSA and the 1987 Constitution, when basically you overhauled the entire government. So talagang
personalize yung estado nung panahon ni Senior, diba? So you have to build a new modern state out of nowhere, and then you had an erupt along the road, you had 8 kutas around the road. So in short, very young pa yung estado natin. This is barely, it's probably even younger than you and I, no? Pag tinignan mo, I mean, it is, right? It's younger than you and I, practically. When you look at the collective effort to build the, because I would say it really just started with Ramos. Because Corazon, it's just coups and mess, right? Really, Ramos was the first one who started it. So this is barely a 3-decade-old modern state building approach. Just to put things into context, diba? Kasi naalala ko sa Succession, spoiler, sabi nung si Skarsgård doon, sabi niya, "Oh, America, you're just a 50-year-old democracy. You're kind of like Botswana," sabi niya. Of course, he was referring to, when the African Americans had enough vote. I mean, sufficient rights compared to, so parang for me, that kind of helped me. Oh nga, no, if titingnan mo yung Pilipinas, our modern state effort is just like 3 decades old, right? Because we never had something modern until then. So can you tell me a little bit about, so after that, how did the Aquino administration approach this issue? And did you feel the pressure for infrastructure spending? Because this was increasingly becoming a popular issue, di ba? Naalala yung traffic in 2015, 2016. I mean, so traffic was a political issue by this time. And then si Mar said something like, dahil umasenso tayo, or like, you know what I'm saying? Like, that's really where Duterte was born. Of his agenda, right?
So because of that, of course, like I said, maraming kailangan i-reform na aspects ng budget operations din. So that began with amending rin yung mga general provisions in the budget, amending the issuances of DBM, and being very, very careful about releasing funds, especially when it involved savings and augmentation. Like there was a time halos ayaw pumirma nung ayaw pumirma ng
babalikan sila.
That had a chilling effect. That's how
may stigma na
about used to characterize that period after the DAP ruling. So it had a lot of chilling effect, and that's not also good kasi kapag natakot na yung mga career officials mo na pumirma, paano na naman gagalaw yung mga projects, di ba? If I'm a director in the OTR, for example, and we're going to procure for yung, I remember yung yung procurement ng additional MRT cars. Kung ikaw yung director, ikaw yung ASIC, ikaw yung USEC, right after that, di ka pa matatakot pumirma ng mga procurement documents, ng mga contract agreements, service agreements, whatever. So I'm not making excuses, of course, for
This is just an objective analysis of the state of play, no? Yeah. So,
but that was it. People in the entire bureaucracy felt it.
yeah.
Talagang may chilling effect sa lahat ng especially yung mga career officials who some of them during that time pa-retire na sila eh. So, syempre na yan, mas risk averse na sila sa mga and more careful.
Suzara, my reading was we had a situation which was unique, which was more like a crime of omission, right? Like usually the problem is crime of commission, as in commission literally sometimes commission, right? But I think one problem we had back then is crime of omission because of this fear na baka masangkot ka sa kung ano-ano. And of course, Supreme Court ruling really created chilling effect. So I'm glad that you're mentioning that because it's one thing na magkaroon ng corruption, it's another thing na wala kang ginawang project at wala rin serbisyo na dumating. So I think, again, this was a very unique problem we had.
Yes.
Aquino,
yes.
Which I think
imagine politically, that was the political climate. People were protesting against pork barrel, but it had that effect on people in the bureaucracy. Kasi, I mean, imagine Supreme Court struck down pork barrels, struck down some acts under the DAP. And paano kami gagalaw? Alam mo yung ganong feeling ng mga mga tao sa yung mga technocrats in the bureaucracy. So yeah,
so that partly explains this kind of imbalance, Suzara, which is like on one hand, Philippines' economic growth is very high, but the public infrastructure, a lot of services are still nowhere close to that. So meron kang parang weird imbalance na ganun, di ba? So, and I think that again had political implications.
Yes.
So yun nga, again, I want people, because there's a tragic aspect to this, diba? There's a tragic aspect to this. Again, just to be fair, for me, like I know maybe it looks like I'm digressing, but like for me, if you look at the earlier years of Marcos Sr., I think he really had grand vision for the country. He was among the smarter presidents we had, but there was a tragic, cronyism and all of that later on. Dito naman with the Pinoy time, there was really, I think, a vision for a clean government, etc. But then again, that came to haunt it because it made it very difficult to make big decisions, fiscal policy, project decisions that could, make you vulnerable to the very things you're fighting against, right? So and here you can see, because I would say that Aquino administration was really the high water mark of post-Marcos era in terms of pushing for clean, good governance. At the same time, ang daming kakulangan na nangyari. Part of that is because of what we're discussing here. Now, if you were gonna give just kind of a fair scoring system, like san tama yung how do you again, of course you keep on talking about the structural constraints, no, legal constraints, circumstances, but san siguro naging sana mas proactive or sana mas ingat ang Aquino administration? Where do you think it was strong and where do you think it could have done better, and what? Again, kasi for us yun nga yung problema eh. In the normal public discourse, it's a question of sinong masama, sinong hindi, right? But for me, each administration had its strengths and weaknesses. So what is your assessment of the Aquino administration in terms of strengths and weaknesses from a fiscal budgetary standpoint? Yeah.
From a fiscal and budgetary standpoint, I think honestly, I wish we communicated it more to the public. Kasi it was only how do I say this? Parang the efforts kasi at fiscal consolidation, pushing for economic growth, lowering the poverty numbers. Mas appreciated siya ng international community but not but not the
Kasi walang budget, babe.
the
Kailangan. No,
arena.
I'm being honest, right? Yun yung kulang nun eh. Yung mga pro-Aquino influencers, I'm not sure how many of them were really, good communicators of public policy in the ways that you're doing today, right? So I think you're right. Kulang ng budget, babe, on
Yeah,
Twitter.
yeah.
I mean, it sounds funny, but actually I'm being honest. I think yun yung kulang nun. And that's why I'm doing what I'm doing, right? Why do you think I'm doing all of these things? Because ang realization ko is kulang talaga bloggers,
Yeah.
leaders who reach out to the people. Because even
Yeah,
I back then as a political science person was not really appreciating a lot of these nitty-gritty issues. But you're absolutely right. Internationally, you go to Bloomberg, you go to Wall Street Journal, Pastar Philippines. No, but locally, people are wondering, nasaan yung proyekto? Nasaan yung ganun? Hindi nila na-appreciate yung problema.
I think kasi part of it was also because the administration set really high really high targets for itself. Ang taas kasi talaga. So the moment na makaramdam talaga ng dissatisfaction yung mga tao, even if people in the bureaucracy have done a lot of I mean, it's to be fair to be fair rin sa mga sa cabinet, hindi rin biro kasi to marshal the entire bureaucracy towards a singular goal. Let's deliver services and let's make sure we hit our economic growth targets. So talagang yun from top down. Yun yung may vision yung may vision yung bureaucracia, and yung people were motivated to pitch in depending on the kind of work that they do. And I mean, I'm not saying this na not saying this na subjective lang yung yung comment ko. These are actually comments from a lot of people in the bureaucracy that I know. Yun yung general general feeling nila. But yeah, I wish we communicated a lot more because pero yun nga yun din yung challenge yung ang hirap din naman kasing i-communicate nung constitutional issues, tapos naunahan ka na ng mga bloggers and at that time wala namang ganun yung government. But the government during President Aquino's time had very, very little funds for communication. President Aquino was somehow allergic to communications, the communications funds. And sa kanya, let's maximize public funds for public goods and services. So, yun. And
I would say it was a combination of perhaps complacency and some would even say hubris, right? This idea na magpasalamat sila, we're doing our best here, di ba? Parang which I think is naive in the context of the Philippines of how emotionally charged they were. There are many supporters who were very angry. There are many supporters of many people who are not happy. I know that one of the most rabid supporters of Duterte, for instance, later on, were people who work with Justice Corona, for instance. So Aquino administration was making a lot of enemies. Precisely because it was trying in its own version to push for good government, but that made you very vulnerable to counterattacks. And I won't also endorse everything that Aquino did. I think there were certain things that were essentially problematic, but that's a different context. Now we're just looking at the externalities and the casualties, the non-political casualties of the political situation, right? Including fiscal policy and the room for maneuver that they had there. So you're saying one problem was you felt sana more budget babes like you back then. The other one was, what was it? What was the other one again? Sorry, medyo may lagnat ako. I mean, generally better communicating. What else? I mean, do you think there was a lack of political will or too much political will? I mean, what was going on there?
I wouldn't say lack of political will kasi there was actually so much political will. That's why ang daming na achieve in 6 years. I mean, halimbawa yung pag-pave ng lahat ng national roads. I mean, 3 decades for the longest time hindi na pave lahat ng national roads, and the administration was able to do that. Yung classrooms, yung school buildings ng DepEd, na-close yung gap, including the gap nung administration ni President.
There was the Yolanda, right? The Yolanda situation was like once every 50 years, diba? At least back then for climate
Yes,
change getting worse.
yes. Oo. So I think 'yon, yung Yolanda rin caused a lot of of political damage kasi yun, hindi rin siguro well, to me, hindi rin siguro nag-communicate effectively yung government during that time. I mean, hindi nag-communicate in the sense na it didn't harness whatever was emerging, the emerging platforms at that time. Kasi well, ayaw rin kasi nila ng one of the things rin that they were very serious about was yung attempt to dismantle patronage politics. So that's why kapag may projects, ayaw nila na it's attributed to President Aquino, it's attributed to anyone. So wala yung mga papogi pictures in projects. So like imagine pag may may road project, ang makikita mo yung form ng COA na ito ganyan how much
the credit grabbing that
and
credit
so it was
grabbing,
yes you're right because we didn't really communicate a lot about the achievements. It was so easy to credit grab, especially yung mga infrastructure projects na natapos during the first year of President Duterte's term. At marami yun.
Exactly. So like hashtag, Marcos is gonna do a lot to Duterte too, and a lot of Duterte projects are gonna finish under his term, including yung Metro project. Now, transition naman tayo sa Duterte era. What is the good? What is the not so good? What is the ugly? What are your assessment? Because for me, the most influential technocrat in contemporary Philippine history, I would argue, even since Cesar Virata, I would say, is Jokno. Right? I mean, he served in the DBM, he served in Bangko Central, he's now served as Finance Secretary. There are rumors that he wants to go back to Bangko Central. He's almost already talking for Bangko Central because of Maharlika Fund, which we're going to discuss shortly. Jokno is an interesting guy because his daughter was my professor sa economics, sa development econ, etc. Fantastic person. But as far as the father, like I have a lot of issues with him in terms of minsan medyo may pagkayabang and all of that. But some would also say, a friend of mine is, I think, a fanboy na yata si Leloy Claudio Kay. He loves, love na love niya si Benjamin Jokno. I think he has a new book coming up. We can have a debate about that, park muna natin yung debate natin among us, diba? Cabal debates. Now going back to this, what is your understanding of that? Because I have jokingly said there's something like, I call it Jokno quotient, right? Like whenever Jokno is there, tumataas yung budget deficit. Like whether it's like during Estrada time, during, what I'm saying? Mahilig siya gumastos, diba? Aggressive siya. But some would argue that yun nga yung naging problema sa panon ni Pinoy na couldn't spend as much because of what happened with the app, etc. And then now you have this aggressive spending. I think the 5% was achieved with I'm talking about the infrastructure spending, etc. was achieved under him. 5.5% even, I was told. Tax effort is pretty decent, 15.5%. So like the numbers are not looking too bad, right? So what do you think were the things that went right during so obviously it's not Digong himself, right? Because he's talking about macroeconomics. You're talking about the technocrats, right?
Yes.
What's your assessment of Jokno as the DBM secretary? What did he get right? What did he didn't get so right? And then let's transition na to Maharlika Fund. Kasi para sa akin, hindi tayo pwede mag-usap ng Maharlika Fund unless i-clear muna natin itong landscape, the fiscal landscape in the country. And let's be fair, we're trying to be as non-partisan as possible and fair as possible. Yes.
Yeah. So, si Secretary Jokno, of course, was Budget Secretary of ERA. And yun nga, so basically hindi natapos yung term niya because na-oust si ERA. Anyway, so he returned to DBM nung term ni President Duterte. And Secretary Jokno is actually, I believe, a USEC. Yeah, before he was
he was number 2 before. Yeah, he was number 2.
He was USEC before he was Budget Secretary during so definitely he was familiar with the institution. Talagang hindi mo parang hindi mo naman din I mean, you cannot question rin his
merits. Yeah,
his
sorry,
merit.
Cesar, to come in. Sorry. I mean, the reason also I kind of find joke na interesting is that his undergrad is actually not economics, public at siya. And if you look at his dissertations at Syracuse University, LGU, governance and fiscal issue nakita niya. So he's quite unique, right? He's not your typical top, comptroller.
Yeah.
He usually have accounting and economics background. So he has a very strong public art background also, which I think is a strength in a way. Now, whether he use it properly, let's discuss that.
Yeah. So that was his background. And well, to be fair to Secretary Jokno, many of the budget reforms, especially especially those that had to do with improving public financial management, many of those that were started naman by the Aquino administration, tinuloy naman niya. Oo. But one of the major things lang that he abolished and discontinued was yung bottom-up budgeting. Because for him, in his view, that was a tool for patronage politics. But that's another issue altogether. So yun yung niya.
Sorry, do you want to discuss the bottom of budgeting? Ito ba yung Porta Alegre? I mean, this is the World Social Forum ba yung katilingan yan, di ba? Which is the idea that you give the community a say in allocation of funds. Like, kung sa tingin nyo, mas mahalagang health kaysa road building, discuss that with people, right? Can you discuss that? Because parang along with Bolsa Familia, I mean, like the 4Ps, there are a lot of people pick up from Latin America, right? Progressive.
Yes.
The problem though is like it comes into the Philippines, suddenly gets diluted, right, by our political economy. Can you explain that? The whole participatory budgeting,
So that's actually one major reform then that was introduced in DBM. So participatory everything, participatory governance, participatory budgeting. And participatory budgeting was a huge program of the Aquino administration, together with the 4Ps program. The 4Ps program was not legislated pa during that time. And like yung mga ibang projects din naman, it started if I'm not mistaken, parang a smaller scope nung GMA admin, but it was expanded nationwide during the Pinoy admin. So in tandem with bottom up budgeting, that was essentially two of the strategies to towards poverty alleviation, and of course empowering the grassroots. Kasi yung 4Ps may hindi naman siya yung dole out lang talaga, kasi 'di ba may conditional, kaya nga siya conditional cash transfer. So those two programs were essentially inspired by programs that were implemented in Latin America. But ang difference natin kasi is we were more ambitious than the Latin American inspiration, kasi we implemented it nationwide, yung sa Latin America. Except for tong si Bolsa Familia, which was
Brazil was nationwide, and Brazil is big.
Brazil was nationwide, but their bottom-up budgeting version was like a pilot in one municipality.
Sa Porta, just one, like Cebu nila, parang just to put it, the rough equivalent ng Cebu nila.
And so bottom-up budgeting was done on a nationwide levels. Actually, when I left government and I was working na for USAID projects, and I go and I do field work, marami pa ako nakakausap noon na na communities telling me how it changed their livelihood. Yung iba parang for the longest time, like one community in outside, what's that, yung surfing town sa Siargao. Kung isipin mo, lang siya, 2 hours, an hour or so away from Siargao.
So I'm still recovering from my Coron sunburn. So go ahead.
Walang livelihood for the longest time. And I got to interview them. This is a fishing community. And they said, malaking tulong yung bottom-up budgeting, kasi at least they were able to access yung mga simple technologies to be able to make.
Tinanggal ni yan.
That was scrapped by Secretary Jokno.
Right.
And then I remember when his first couple of years in DBM, he also implemented yung cash-based budgeting reform. And in principle,
Paki-explain again. Yeah, paki-explain.
cash-based budgeting reforms basically means what you put in the budget, in the appropriations law, is the actual amount that you're going to spend during that fiscal year. So halimbawa ako, department secretary ako ng DPWH, and then I said, for 2024, I'm going to spend 100 billion pesos. Yun yung ilalagay sa budget. And dapat, by the end of 2024, na-spend ko talaga yung 100 billion pesos. That's essentially cash-based budgeting. That was his antidote to underspending. Kasi remember, yun yung pinanggalingan.
So yun yung DAP niya. Yun yung DAP ni Joke, no? If I could put it that
way. Yun yung reform niya.
Right.
Yun yung reform.
So he had a similar diagnosis of the problem, and then he came up with his own version of solution, right? I mean,
yes. And this is where I don't agree with him, because cash-based budgeting may fix the numbers. It may appear that spending improved, but it doesn't solve, it doesn't
qualitatively
address the core problem of bureaucratic inefficiency. So at the surface level, yes, it will. Kasi syempre,
it's a workaround for you. It's just
it's a workaround for the figures, for the numbers. Why? Because this is the difference. Yung underspending kasi during the Pinoy admin was because the agencies were forced to commit to a certain number, certain amount of projects, certain level na dapat i-implement nila. And the reason is, ito kasi yung kailangan ng mga tao. Okay? Yun yung part ng budget assumption when putting together the entire budget. But in cash-based budgeting, it's different. The question is, what can bureaucratic agencies realistically spend? And what bureaucratic agencies say they can spend is not necessarily the level of spending that's needed to address your socio-economic problems.
So may Soviet Union China system is like, we want the local government to spend this much on infrastructure, right? So it's like, you just meet targets even if those targets themselves are questionable in absorption capacity, whether you kailangan. I get what you're saying. It's very quantitative. It doesn't have a qualitative appreciation.
Yes, it doesn't have a qualitative dimension.
And absorption capacity of bureaucracy.
Yes.
But it's still a move away from the. I mean, again, I'm not trying to apologize for what happened, but I'm just saying, like, workaround at least help for the GDP growth to be sustained, right? Because at least you're getting, again, we're not saying it's a good solution. It's an optimal solution, but it's definitely better than status quo ante, right?
Yes, and from a technical standpoint also, that also forces, that disciplines agencies rin na huwag kayong mag-budget ng hindi nyo naman pala kayang gastos. But that's also part of discipline. Tama naman din. To a certain extent, may point naman din.
Exactly,
It also forces, it also disciplines government agencies to stick to their target spending levels. But the thing is, my other criticism with that reform is that it was not uniformly applied across the bureaucracy. Kasi ang basis nito ay bibigyan mo ng budget kung sino yung nakaka-spend, but if you don't get to spend, diba? You hear that naman in the budget hearings, the budget gets cut. But that's not the case with the DPWH. That's not the case with PNP.
Right. So may mga let's just say favored sectors.
May favored, yes. May favored agencies na, well, yun kasi yung priority ng presidente, yun yung priority ni Secretary Dominguez, di ba? So he was the DOF, during Secretary Jones time. So
Right.
may mga ganong ano, and that was kind of, well, for people like me who's been analyzing the budget, that was obvious to me. Like kaninong turf ito, makikita mo yan kasi sa makikita mo yun sa numeros.
So may pagka-double standards there and
Yes. So to speak,
may distortions, yeah.
Yes, in the
Double
implementation.
spend a lot under Duterte, didn't they? I mean, not big. I think pagdating sa big ticket infrastructure projects, like they barely finished like 12 to 16 out of 100 plus build ni Tatay Digong, diba? But from what I understand, and I think Chalito Habito, some of the other objective people, in fairness, marami mga small, medium scale na nangyari sa LGU level, especially in Mindanao, Visayas, marami rin growth na nangyari. Again, we're here to be fair, right? Yung mga iba dyan na gusto kami itag na dilawan, we're absolutely fair. We're talking about technical realities and spending realities on the ground. What is your assessment of that part? Yung idea na marami namang infrastructure spending nangyari here and there, and DPWH obviously was part of the game. And then, correct me if I'm wrong, there was also the idea that the government was more effective in getting around the whole right-of-way procurement problems before the undermining infrastructure spending. Can you tell us what is your understanding situation there?
Yeah. So, yeah, there was a lot of spending. Why? Because they only had to disburse. They were disbursing. Basically, they were paying for projects that were actually implemented by the previous administration. At marami yun. Kaya
So, katas ni Pinoy.
Oo, di ba? Kaya nga may credit, grabe. Di ba? Fact yun ha, fact yun. I mean, you challenge me, I can show you the numbers. So in the government kasi, okay, technical explanation muna ulit why I say this. Projects may infrastructure projects kasi yung malaki talagang malaking portion ng budget natin, and therefore it contributes to government spending and yun sa GDP natin. So talagang nandoon yung malaking spending. But the Pinoy administration contracted out a lot of infrastructure projects. Nagsisimula na yan. Ang ginagawa. Pero kasi yung bayad nun, pag natapos na yung project, kasi kailangan i-certify yun ng ng DPWH na, completed si project, ganito, ganyan. So, yung maraming projects na hindi natapos within the Pinoy administration, syempre, obligation ng government yun, hindi naman yun i-discontinue ng government porque nag-change yung yung presidential administration. So, marami doon na bayaran first 2 years of the Duterte administration. And syempre, the disbursement figures during that time will be high kasi ang dami billions 5%.
Right. Ang ganda nung na-inherit ni Digong. Like,
yes.
swerte siya sa macroeconomic front. Yeah.
So, yun? Wala naman tayong issue doon kasi that's how our fiscal policies work.
Diba? Dapat nanalo si Marojas para makuha nila yung credit, diba? But it didn't happen, diba? That's how ganyan talaga politika. It is what it is.
Ganun talaga So, yun, nabayaran siya, a lot of it. But if you look at the numbers of DPWH and DOTR, you will see na actually the spending worsened. Nung administration nung si Secretary Singson, Sec Babes, was the DPWH secretary, they were hitting 70% disbursement. Meaning 70% of their budget nagagastos nila. If you check the figures early part of the administration, and I keep saying this on Twitter actually, even in briefings that JC and I do, it's half. It doesn't even reach 50%.
Right.
Because ambitious din yung spending. But then of course, we hear that infra spending is high without actually considering the fact na nagbabayad kasi tayo ng mga previous year's projects. In government kasi, there is such a thing as current year's accounts payables and prior year's accounts payables. So yun. The other thing that made that significantly increased then disbursement is the doubling of the salaries of the police and the military.
Which is what I want to discuss, this whole issue of pension, which is now kind of
Yes.
hunting us. Kasi I don't know how we're going to sustain the situation kung 54, 55-year-old pa lang mag-retire tong si General, and then, you know, bata pa eh. 55, 2020s is like 40 or 30 plus in 1980s, 70s, right? You know, by every demographic standard, bata ka pa at 55, you can start a whole new career, including blogging, right? Or podcasting, literally, right? Can you explain to me also the pension situation? Because this is a fiscal issue, right?
Yeah. Sige. So, but sige, after the bit about disbursement, so it was also high because tumaas yung yung double day, ilan yung natin, ilan yung policemen natin, at saka yung soldiers natin, di ba? And on top of that, you had yearly increases in the salary of government employees. I'm not saying the government our civil servants don't deserve increase in salary,
Right.
because I know for a fact when I was in DBM, the goal of the government was really to increase it, to make it at par with the private
competitive. Yeah, private sector competitive.
Yeah, make it competitive. Pero yung spending doon, yun yung malaking drivers ng spending. Infrastructure and government operations, particularly salaries.
What
So,
about what about the argument that socio-economic spending also increased during the Duterte era, and that may also explain you know, the popularity of the president? Now, you can say if it's populist or not, but I think even as a share of GDP, major significant increase. I had a discussion with Leloy on this issue, and his reading is that this may explain bakit sikat na sikat ang Duterte admin, especially sa mga less privileged na kababayan natin. Again, from a fair numerical standpoint, wasn't there also an increase in social spending? If you look at the World Bank data, some of the interesting data that I see out there,
yes, it increased naman kasi forced to good rin naman kasi yung DBM to increase the budget for social services kasi there was a law.
So perfect timing. You have a lot of budget. So nasakyan mo yung upward swing essentially. Perfect ang pasok ni tatay. I mean, admin ni tatay. Okay, I get what you're saying.
May kasi, nag-legislate ka ng 4Ps law, nag-legislate kayo ng Universal Tertiary Education Act, which incidentally, Secretary Jokno actually opposed along with the doubling of the salaries of the military and uniformed personnel because he knew that it was going to be a fiscal problem later on.
And meron pa nga tayong SSS issue pa lang nung una pa lang, di ba? Which
diba?
In the cabinet. Yep.
So yun, but yeah, yun yung issue. So yes, it increased. If you look at the absolute figures, but if you compare it to the rate of increase of the budgets of the police and the military, mas malaki yung increase nung police and the military because nga nag-increase yung sweldo nila, and then of course funds for the AFP modernization program, which the Duterte administration also cannot stop kasi may batas, 'di ba? Less
right. I mean, of course. So what you're saying is that yes, it's true that, I mean, facts are facts, but you have to deconstruct the facts and their context. Exactly. Which is important, right? Because if you just look at the numbers on the surface level, it might give you certain impression that may not actually hold water once you deconstruct it. But was there like major mistakes by the DBM, especially during the pandemic time? Because my understanding is Department of Finance kind of tepid yung response. Because if you look at the response of a lot of our peers in ASEAN, parang lower half ng Philippines in terms of per capita, in terms of share of GDP, in terms of yung let's call it recovery fund, no? Of dealing with the pandemic. What is your understanding from the DBM? But this is where I give credit to Jokno because by this time nasa BSP na siya, and I think that's good aggressive expansionary monetary policy. Medyo na QE, quantitative easing siya, but DBM is yours, so I want to understand. Okay, umalis na si Jokno, whoever is next, sino bang nag-replace kay Jokno? Okay, I remember. Yeah, Davao friend of the. Now, can you tell me about that? What is your assessment of the performance of DBM during the biggest crisis of our era so far?
Actually, Iyon, when syempre may politics rin within the economic team, 'di ba? So,
Exactly. Given yan.
when Secretary Joc, left DBM and moved to BSP, so essentially, it was Secretary Dominguez calling the shots na. And
Right.
to be honest, yung decision-making power talagang sa kanya eh. So he was the one deciding how much lang yung level na gagastusin. So yes, you're right, conservative yung naging
Very fiscally conservative. Very
yes,
tempted.
very
Yeah.
fiscally conservative yung economic aid and stimulus package at that time. I remember 2-3 years ago at the height of the pandemic, I was in a couple of fora with fiscal analyst around Southeast Asia. And they were
Right.
telling na in
Thailand, Malaysia.
Indonesia, in Thailand, Indonesia, they were already disbursing the fourth, the fifth, the fifth
Yeah.
round of
French na.
ayuda.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Siyempre, alam natin yung mga pinsan natin, lola natin sa Amerika, nakakuha ng $2,000, mga katas ni Trump, katas ni Biden. Like, ako sa QC, kahit isang juice lang, wala akong nakuha dito. Like, talagang, you could see it. Tepid talaga yung response. Even compared to other quote-unquote third world peers natin. Super konti. And I think that may explain bakit our contraction was so deep. 9.6%.
Yes.
Comparable to 3% in Indonesia, right? Considering our lockdowns were heavier. So your sense is whoever was whatever his name, yung DBM chief natin, no, was really not really the top guy back then. It is really Dominguez calling the shot, and it was tepid and all. And then towards the end of Duterte era, what do you think is the legacy in terms of the fiscal picture? Because didn't Duterte push for tax reforms, and wasn't that tax reform supposed to help the fiscal situation to raise more funds? What is your assessment of the tax reforms that Duterte?
Yes. So what was it? A train, di ba? At the first half of the administration.
Was it a train wreck, or was it like whatever? Or was it good?
Yeah. So train, it was actually parang yung train pa lang parang ano ba talagang numero? Parang the projection was it started with 150 billion hanggang sa pababa na ng pababa until it was legislated. I don't know what the actual revenue collection is because of train. But nonetheless, it was not enough. Clearly it was not enough to finance the infrastructure development program. Build. It was not enough to finance that. Like, I mean, I remember yung train, yun yung lagi nilang sinasabi na they will legislate train in order to finance build ganyan. But the fact of the matter is tinaas naman din kasi talaga yung budget to deficit ratio when Secretary Joc was DBM secretary. So it was 2% when at the end of the Pinoy admin, they increased it to 3%. So this is why you said kanina na he was more aggressive doon sa spending. It was because of that. So talaga with or without train, tataas talaga yung deficit kasi they were hoping to hit 8% of GDP na infrastructure spending, which never happened.
I think 6% was really the highest they could aim for realistically.
Yes, which never happened, and now they're back to 5 point something. That range na 5 to 6, di ba? So yun yung yun yung nangyari fiscally, and then a lot of I would say a lot of political discretion na naman over the budget, which we tried to do away with by implementing yung mga itemization, line item budgeting, zero-based budgeting, convergence budgeting, lahat na ng possible na budget reforms na ni-recommend ng World Bank, IMF, and other European countries. We tried to do them, but cash-based budgeting became the centerpiece. There was a different version of program budgeting na ata. But then, all of these will fall apart if walang maayos na leadership at governance.
Well, that's a big problem, right? That was clearly a big problem with the with the mayor president who was admittedly like walang alam sa economics and all, which is very different
Hey,
from
he just left it.
Arroyo, very different from Aquino, very different from
Ramos.
Marcos, at least attended, I don't know paano siya nagmasters sa Wharton, but like whatever, right? At least he understands the basics, no?
Yes, yes. Oo. So, yun yung naging problem doon. So, you see a budget before the pandemic that was so full of populist programs, infrastructure development, which is not bad. I agree naman eh. Kailangan naman talaga i-modernize yung infrastructure. But my issue with it is, ano napupunta sa pork barrel?
Right. Can you discuss that? Like, was there ano yung mga new versions of pork barrel na lumabas and how big they were from your off estimate?
Yeah, so remember pork barrel, aka PDAF, was struck down by the Supreme Court, but it re-emerged in a different form. Na basically nag-i-insert ka ng budget ng programs during budget preparation and budget legislation. Dati kasi it was fixed eh. There was a set amount. I think 80 million pesos during that time. And dun lang maglalaro. There was a limit to how much legislators can get. But that was essentially abolished. That regime was abolished, and then actually the ruling of the Supreme Court on PDAF was yung prohibition on post-enactment intervention of legislators. In simple terms, kapag napasa na ang budget, hindi na pwedeng makialam ang legislators sa DBM, sa executive branch.
Kasi wala na, cross the line.
Wala na. X na kayo. Parang this is entirely the job of the But you know naman how creative our politicians
are. They're ang dami mga feedback loops.
Yeah, they can easily circumvent rules.
Right.
So what happened now was during budget legislation na i-insert.
Right.
And you see that in the growth of the numbers for local projects in the budget of the DPWH. We're not saying hindi kailangan ng communities, but what I'm trying to drive at is we have limited resources, we have a lot of needs, but we need to prioritize.
Right.
So pwedeng build tapos non-strategic infrastructure like multipurpose halls, mga ganyan. Ano yun, di ba? Parang ano mo
the same thing about Marcos Sr., right? He built a lot of things, but there are big questions about saan ka kumuha ng pera, yung utang na nakuha mo. Ito ba, may ROI ba to? Kamusta yung ROI? Kasi unfortunately, a lot of people get impressed with just how much you build, but we have to understand it has to make economic sense over the long run, etc. So that is populist, right? Like just building building without really evaluating. And what you're also arguing, Suzara, is that hindi rin natin ma-assess. We don't have still real assessment of ano yung added value ng train law, no? Because let me be honest, the disaster that some of our friends or your friends were suggesting perhaps did not happen, but also it's arguable whether it also created all the benefits that the Tatay people were mentioning. So it's kind of up in the air, right? We still have to break that down. Yeah.
I actually don't know if PIDS already has a study of
on that. Yeah, interesting. Yeah, I've saw a lot of PIDS on RCEP, on TPP. But for some reason, parang hinahanap ko pa rin yung dito sa.
Parang wala pa rin ako nakita.
Exactly, yun nga. So that's the problem. It's hard to make certain assessments because a lot of them are like projections that may not come true. And speaking of projections, obviously we'll talk about that under Maharlika because allegedly NEDA has a projection of 35,000 new jobs that will be created, which is like another thing, another suntok sa buwan after discuss. But before talking about Maharlika,
build, meron daw I don't know, multiplier effects na naman study na nalabas.
Although of course, our good friends like Walden Bellew are very big fans of the argument of multiplier effect. This is very John Maynard Keynes, diba? But before going to the Maharlika Fund, can you just tell us very quickly, how was Budget Babe born? What were the circumstances? Sa inits ba yan? Sa mga walang yang mga bloggers na inatak yung legacy ng, administration you work for? Tell me a little bit about the whole Budget Babe and the whole persona, where it come from? Because I know, Suzara, you're like, matinista ka, mabait ka eh, pero yung balahura mo, UP level na. So, I'm blaming yung mga kasama mong balahurang taga-UP or ako, di ba? Kami yung mga balahura eh. So, where is this coming from? Where did Budget Babe come from?
Well, actually, ano eh, parang, it was not deliberate. Parang for the longest time, I was just a lurker on Twitter. I mean, I can't tweet, of course, kasi nasa government ako nung I joined Twitter. And then,
So, when did you go pro? Like, all the way? Like,
it was all, it was all accidental. I started tweeting lang actively about the budget during the pandemic. Like, I remember I got locked down in Puerto
Yeah,
Galera.
I remember that. That's also when it got trouble.
I was so bored. So tweet lang ako. Kasi dalawa lang kami ng lola ko doon eh. So yeah, I started tweeting. I was actually just talking to some former colleagues in DBM, and some people somehow noticed the tweets about budget operations, about the COVID-19 funds, and then just JC reached out to me, other people reached out to me, and then people just started following.
Okay, I see.
Parang ganun lang eh, ganun lang.
Right.
Parang people started following kasi at that time, I guess there was a dearth of information about the budget. But I was already but when I left government, I was already doing talaga. I continued doing budget analysis.
Yeah, in our circles, in the warm circles, right? I know that. But you talking about the Twitter persona, right? Because you know me, I have a persona on Twitter, and then I have a persona. If you know me in person, I have a person. So I'm just trying to understand where did that come from? That kind of feisty, you know what I'm saying, in your face, but also very informative account that I'm happy to follow.
Actually, what you see is what you get. But then, well, to you, I'm not feisty. Kasi what ako magiging feisty
no, you're not in person. No, yun nga.
We talk about books. Diba? We talk about policy. So parang there's no reason to be feisty. But a lot of it was because, I'm so frustrated now with how toxic the social media environment is. And parang to me, it was personally, parang I think it's about time I speak up about what it was like working in government. Clear a lot of the misconceptions about budget. And secondary na yung there was a lot of propaganda around fiscal policy and numbers on the budget and spending. So yun, and then it just started from there. Parang feeling ko lang, parang kailangan ng mag-push back. Parang to me, what I don't tolerate offline, I will not tolerate online. It was just as simple as that.
And what gave you kind of the audacity to like to hold your ground and push back against all of these horrible people online? And lalo, especially in Twitter, it's very easy to be toxic because there's just so much you can put inside the Twitter. Yeah, you can make a thread, but who's gonna read the fourth thread? Let's be realistic about this, diba? Sometimes I'll just delete na lang my tweets. Like, it's not helpful because it's easy to just, what I'm saying, like, okay, kaya nga I'm doing this podcast among others, aside from all the writings, because ang hirap talaga, ang hirap. It's and the incentive is to be flashy and crazy and spicy, right? And all of us are guilty in one way or another. But I know very well your intention, my intention, all of that is like, my vacuum eh. There are a lot of, there are a lot of blank, who are doing whatever there. And we shouldn't leave the battlefield to them because kawawa yung taong bayan kung ito yung magiging sources of information nila or misinformation.
Ako, I started talaga, but I became more determined to push back when I started seeing that it wasn't just the journalists and the reporters that were being intimidated online. I mean, like you see sila Ambet Ocampo, truth tellers, subject matter experts, parang invalidate nyo lahat. I mean, what kind of society are we going to have if parang these thinkers, these researchers, these people who studied years and years to
and work in the government like you, I mean, you know how the things operate, exactly. So what also stands for science and reason, parang ganun, like fighting for enlightenment, right? No, I mean that's the problem, right? They're gonna
Yes.
attack all of us
Yes.
as long as we don't follow the script, right?
Yeah.
Anyone who diverges with the script because of your expertise, because of your conscience, with what you're gonna be there. Actually, yun yung cancel culture sa Philippines. It first started with that side before going woke cancel culture, right? Yung idea of trying to cancel you out, etc. Now, obviously, that placed you in a perfect position when this whole Maharlika Fund came about. So what is your understanding of the Maharlika Fund? Where is this coming from? Has it evolved enough? And what are the things that you're worried about? Or who knows, maybe there'll be a pleasant surprise. I don't know. Like, where is this coming from?
Actually, to be quite honest, I was also surprised. Parang, ba't biglang may Maharlika at the end of the year? Because for one, it was not in the president's SONA. It was never brought up during the campaign period. The economic managers never talked about it until it was filed na in Congress. Kumbaga
Hi,
parang unlike
Sandro. Yeah.
kumbaga unlike build, walang build up towards conditioning people that there's going to be a Maharlika investment fund, so sovereign wealth fund daw. But parang bakit sovereign wealth fund? Saan tayo kumuha ng wealth in the first place? Deficit nga, di ba? Parang during that time, it
Sa
was
pandemic rin nila naisip yan. There were some people that were
post-pandemic
there.
ka. Yeah,
Mag-Bitcoin tayo, National Bitcoin Fund. You know what I'm saying? Like, I mean, I'm sure may mga henyo nag-iisip ng kung ano-ano dyan, di ba? I-Bitcoin na natin. Parang, sino yung sa El Salvador ba yung presidente? Bukele, ano? Yung mga ganon, di ba? Marami mga ganon. Mag-Bitcoin natin yan. Like, what is your understanding? Because, sorry for cutting you there, because my thing is, Marcos is like a interesting political, phenomenon because he's both technocratic and also populist, right? Like he's a weird combination of the two, right? Like if you look at his sauna, the first 30 minutes is music to your ears if you're into econ macro policy lingo. You may not even agree with him, but it's like finally someone's talking about these things. No? At the same time, bigla may mga libreng bigas, you know what I'm saying? Talano Gold, yung mga ganon, di ba? So may ganun may pagka-split effect dyan So for me, I was not surprised something like Maharlika Fund will come about because it's a perfect embodiment of this oxymoronic situation of technocratic populism. It's pa sovereign wealth fund and then may Maharlika, which we know exactly what's the connotation here.
Yeah. But yeah, from ako naman, I was coming of course from a fiscal standpoint. So parang parang ano daw? Parang but anyway, siguro parang to begin the conversation. Maganda ulit we talk about context like we did nung yung discussion natin sa Matuwid, GMA administration, Duterte administration. So let's contextualize Maharlika. Especially yung fiscal situation natin. Kasi obviously, galing tayo sa pandemic. But a lot of economists a lot of analysts have already been telling us na mataas yung debt to GDP ratio. Tumaas siya. So that's basically the portion of our debt to our GDP figures. Mataas na siya. Imagine from less than 40, umabot na siya ng 60 plus at some point. So ngayon ata 60. So yan yung situation. When President Marcos delivered his SONA and when the economic managers were constituted, ang sabi nila, the priority was quote-unquote fiscal consolidation, meaning tatry nila pababain, i-manage yung debt. Okay, so yan yung context. Another important issue that we're facing it fiscally is yun nga, yung sabi natin kanina, yung pension ng military. Why is it an issue? Kasi ang laki-laki na ng funding requirement na kailangan. I've actually been bringing this up since we went public about our budget analysis na it's really a looming fiscal crisis kasi when President Duterte doubled the salaries of the police and the military, the effect was magdodoble rin yung pension ng military because there is a pension indexation law na martial law pa nung pinasa. So there's a presidential decree. So based on that, it was never amended. So it's pegged. So para kung ikaw yata ay like if you retire at a certain level, parang two steps higher ata yung makuha mo na pension. So tumaas yung sweldo ng active military personnel, tumaas sweldo ng active na police personnel, tumataas rin yung MUP pension. GSIS, I believe, and the Treasury did the projection, and the figure that they came up with is almost 1 trillion pesos per year just for the pension. Imagine how big that is. Almost 1 trillion a year, and it's equivalent to the infrastructure program na halos na 1 trillion. Just 1 year yun na. Parang imagine in 5 years, meron ko 5 trillion pension requirement. So that's the context. Kulang ang pera. The third is the Mandanas-Garcia ruling, which as you know, but for the sake of your listeners, explain natin ano yung Mandanas ruling. The Mandanas-Garcia ruling. The Mandanas-Garcia ruling was a ruling of the Supreme Court that essentially said yung share ng local government units from national taxes dapat kasama, hindi na lang yung internal revenue, dapat kasama na yung customs duty. So that means tumaas yung portion, tumaas yung share ng local government units from the internal revenues generated by the national government. That means bawas yung fiscal space o yung total amount ng pera na pwedeng gastusin ng national government every year because ibababa niya sa local government. Malaki siya. It's almost 800, 900 trillion. Remember that? MUP or the military pension, almost 1 trillion requirement every year. Mandanas-Garcia ruling, almost 1 trillion every year as well. And then
ito yung additional fund na pupunta sa LGU, right? Which joke
yes. It used to be, diba? It used to be called the ERA, the Internal Revenue Allotment, but now it's called the National Tax Allotment kasi kasama na yung ibang taxes dun sa computation. So you have that situation fiscally. And then you came out of the pandemic where the debt to GDP is high. The deficit, of course, is high, meaning yung budget versus yung revenues, kulang yung revenues. So, the way our fiscal authorities operate is such that every year before budget preparation period, nagde-decide sila ano ba yung level ng spending, ano yung projected level ng revenues, that's combination na yun ng tax and non-tax revenues, dividends from GOCCs. Then they compute that. Malalaman nila ano yung deficit. So I have I'll try to show figures. So not share. Slide show natin para malinaw. Ayan. So for 2023, this year for example, the total disbursements or yung total spending daw is pegged at 5.1 trillion pesos. But the revenues, 3.6 trillion lang. So minus mo yun. So meron kang mga 1.45 trillion na deficit. So saan kukunin yun? Utangin yan sa multilateral agencies or mag-issue ng bonds, si Treasury. So, di ba malaki? 1.45 trillion pesos. So, lahat-lahat na yan. Yung 5 trillion na spending, that's the budget of the entire government. So, now, Maharlika. Stop share muna tayo. Now, Maharlika, that requires 500 billion pesos capitalization from the national government. Just think about those three major items. Pension, Mandanas ruling, capitalization ng BSP. 2.5 trillion pesos in 1 year if sabay-sabay silang i-implement.
Yeah.
Yung revenues natin, 3.6. It's
Lang.
going to
Yeah.
increase. Yes, it's
It's
not
like
going
70% of your total revenues or something like that put together.
Yes. But it's not going to increase. The revenues will not increase by 1 trillion pesos next year. It might increase by 200 billion, ganyan. But definitely not, it will not increase as much as the expenditures and investment ko na kailangan. So, and then, minadali, essentially ng Congress, both the lower and the upper chambers, yung Maharlika. And these are the same people who legislates the budget, who sits in the development budget coordinating committees, hearings, briefings about the government's fiscal situation. So how can you even consider that, di ba? If the goal of the Marcos administration is fiscal consolidation, bakit ganito? Bakit dagdag ng ng gastos and quote unquote gastos ng pagkakagastosan ng investment. But syempre their argument is it will earn naman profits. Pero the difference between
Walang kasiguraduhan yan eh. Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say the difference between putting it in the budget and putting it in and making it an investment fund and investing it in other investment funds is the element of risk. So sabihin natin sa budget, sige, given na nandyan yung leakage and corruption. Yung sa Maharlika, risk plus leakage plus possible corruption given the version of the law as it was passed by Congress. So yun yung dun pa lang fiscal context pa lang medyo parang
What you're saying is that we're not at the threshold whereby we have room for risky maneuvers or something like that. Parang lubog ka nga sa utang, marami kang problema, tapos naglalagay ka pa sa tabi yung maliit na meron ka for bibili ka ng Bitcoin or something like that, you know, like hoping that medyo may pagka-beef Netflix na yung nangyari yung kapatid nung like, you get what I'm saying? Now, the counter argument, because we want to be fair here, diba? We're not here just to bash, what Marcos does. The counter argument would be, well, Indonesia has a sovereign wealth fund, Ghana has that, Egypt has that. It's not like they're paragons of economic prosperity or high income countries, right? Because I remember very well the first argument counterattack came from, interestingly, Amy Marcos, who said, ay, pang Norway yan, pang Saudi, ganun yan. Well, obviously, we're not that level, but in fairness, Egypt has it, Indonesia have it. These are mostly lower middle or barely upper middle income countries. So how is it okay? So parang sasabihin ng iba, parang dinidiscriminate mo naman dahil third world tayo, kunyari. So bakit tayo wala? Bakit Ghana meron? Bakit Nigeria meron? Bakit Egypt? Bakit Indonesia meron? Hindi naman sila mayaman na bansa. What would you say to those people?
Well, yeah, yung sinasabi ko nga kanina, parang when did they come up with that fund? Parang this is all about the timing. And I think si Senator Risa Ontiveros, she had the same, I mean, kasi in principle, who wouldn't want the government to earn profits from investment? Pero the fact is, this is the reality now. We don't have extra. Parang if the government is, for example, compare natin sa personal finance. Alam ko na magbabayad ako, let's say, ng utang ko sa tito ko. Alam ko na magbabayad ako ng utang ko sa kapatid ko. So yon. Utang na naman ako ng bago. Hindi ko pa nga nababayaran yung dati kong utang. Tapos yung uutangin ko, ilalagay ko sa Bitcoin. Paano kung matalo? Yung income ko, hindi naman tumataas. It's fixed. Well, you can argue that the government's income is not fixed. But the point is, hindi naman siya aabot sa level na suddenly overnight ma-recover mo yung ma-recover mo yung yung loss.
Sarah, what about the counter argument that, well, I mean, this is a long-term issue. There are going to be some losses here, but over the long run, the house wins. And that idea that parang unfair na i-compare ito sa private budget because the state cannot go bankrupt, technically speaking, right? So parang, aren't your metaphors problematic? And, you know, this is generally also the metaphor against austerity, right? That austerity arguments make sense on the individual level, but I'm just trying to be fair, you know? What about that counter argument na, well, maybe now hindi magandang panahon, but this is for the next 50, 100 years, and who knows, maybe in the next 20 years, kumita ng malaki yan.
Oo. Yung sagot ko kasi dyan, parang it has to do rin with the goal of of the Maharlika Investment Corporation and the fund itself. Kasi to me, it's really confusing. Ano ba ang goal? Mag-profit o yung sinasabi niyong development financing? Kasi kung development financing, how are you? I mean, by the nature of it, financing development projects, you will not earn a profit. Because those are to build, establish public goods and services. So ano ba talaga in the first place yung goal? Kasi I feel like it's so conflated na okay, profit tapos biglang development to finance development. So ano ba talaga? So parang fundamentally may parang
Sabi. Ako, my understanding, Suzara, is like, it became already a face issue because first it's called Maharlika and second, very close to the president push for it. So parang my sense is they're just trying to find the path of least resistance and get whatever version out. That's really because if you look at the version A that came out last year versus what it went through, parang 5.0 na abot ng tayo na iPhone 14 net or Xiaomi 10. You know what I'm saying? Like, ang dami. So parang part of it is parang pinipilit lang nila whatever has the path of resistance. Yeah, sabi ni Tulfo, tanggalin na rin. Basta may papasa dyan. That's one understanding I have of it. The second thing as I have is, I agree with you that it's big enough to be a problem because of all the liabilities we have. But at the same time, a $10 billion sovereign wealth fund, it's a joke. It's a pipsqueak fund on a global scale, right? Like, I mean, no offense. Okay, I'm not in a car, but you're gonna enter a room with all the Ferraris and BMWs and Benz at nakano ka, di ba? Tapos gusto makipag-ano sa big boys. I mean, a 10 billion fund is like a joke compared to what other countries have, di ba? So, parang medyo trying hard, hindi ba? Parang may pagka-pretentious din ng that. Like, it's big for us given our problems, but it's a joke on the global level. What $10 billion is not even the earnings of Elon Musk on a, you know what I'm saying, on a few days basis. So, yun ang problema ko. It's too big given our liabilities, but it's too small to even
for
really make big gains.
Global financial market.
Exactly. If you want to make big gains, you have to have huge enough, you know what I'm saying, base to go wrong here, to go right here, and more than make up. But 10 billion is so small. So it's like 200 million here, 500. Like, I don't know. Like, I really have a problem with this kasi parang feeling ko pinipilit na lang siya. But I want to ask you this question. How do you feel when government technocrats who should know better kind of come up with all sorts of interesting explanations around it, right? Like, how do you feel about that? I mean, ako personally, love ko si Balisacan. I interviewed him last year when he was just like, he's a person I can vouch for his integrity, no? So hindi naman siya enabler, whatever. At the same time, you're hearing that there are these estimates by NEDA, ganun, parang, I don't know about it. I mean, this is where I agree with JC, right? Which is, you cannot just take what the technocrats say on the face value, which is also exactly my criticism against economists. Like, independent economists lang may say sa mga issues na ganun. But you get what I'm saying, na parang, like, just because I think sinabi NEDA doesn't mean we'll just take it at first value. Pag-usapan natin na mabuti yan. But I think kasi Suzara is budget babe, andyan na siya eh. We are welcome to Maharlika Republic. So what is the next thing we can do? I mean, I just said something like, nako, kailangan natin ng good governance fund. Yun ang kailangan natin. And then Enrico said something like, angat buhay. Okay, pwede yan. And then when I said that, dami nagalit sa akin. Sabi nung isa, Eto na nga yung buwis ko nga papunta sa Maharlika, dadagdagan mo ba sa kabila? Sabi ko, ay, hindi si Enrico, kawain
Oo,
niyo pa, di ba?
oo.
But you get what I'm saying? Because I really suggest follow also Enrico because I think he just had an interview with ANC kanina, who has very good data. I really love what he's doing out there, but I also love what you're doing there. You're doing a fantastic job. Ito na, andito na siya. Wala na. Finish na. So anong next? Babantayan natin? Anong gagawin natin? Because one provision that I think JC, Enrico, many people are focused on is like issuance of bond. So yung pala, kung wala tayong masyadong pera, wala problema yan. Utang na naman tayo dyan. Diba? Like, wait lang, parang ano yan ha, weird yan. Kaya nga natuwa ako dun sa interview kay Villar, di ba? Tinanong sa akin, kayo, business people kayo ba mag-invest dyan? Di ba, tingnan mo yung sagot niya, parang 10 minutes na hindi ko alam.
Malabo.
Ano sabi mo dyan, Suzara? So I'm just throwing everything out there.
Yeah.
Tapos na, dyan na eh. Pinilit na eh. Sige na nga, whatever version. What's step 2? What's plan B now? What's the plan B?
Balikan ko yung ano mo yung comment mo about it being too big for us.
Yeah, but too small to matter. Yun nga yung problema ko eh.
Which therefore begs the question, sinong global investor yung mag-i-invest doon?
Right.
Diba? So parang
walang... Baka gagawa rin sila ng Maharlika International Egg. Sila rin.
If it's not attractive enough, I mean, considering the size of the portfolio.
$100 billion is pathetic on a global scale compared to $1 billion of Norway or something like that, right? Like,
you're going to open it up to that. I think, well, yun na nga, nandiyan lang, naghihintay na lang siya ng pirmahan ni Presidente. Pero, I think, for us in civil society, and for analysts like us, I think kailangan continuous yung pag-inform, like fill the vacuum on the policy issues. Let's talk about it. Kasi, well, syempre pag napasa yan, magkakaroon ng ng IRR, but there are many things that we need to watch out for because the provisions are what they are.
Like, so what's the next chapter now? You're right. IRR is very important, implementing rules and regulation. Without IRR, batas are just a statement of motherhood ambitions, right? Parang ganun.
Yeah, so the IRR is coming next, and then it will be of course set up, but I feel that part of it will already be included in the 2024 budget. So let's see magkano yun. Because the national government is supposed to capitalize it by, if I'm not mistaken, 50 billion pesos din. So that's 50 from the national government, 50 from BSP, 25 from Land Bank, DBP. Kung tama yung yung pagkaalala ko dun sa provision.
Yeah, and then what happened to the private sector, right? Di ba that was the World Economic Forum discussion na mag-ambag daw yung mga oligarchs, taga-isa. Walang nag-invest sa kanila, which tells you, maybe they negosyante. Kung mga negosyante walang tiwala, I don't know, whatever.
Baka yung mga local na mga Filipino oligarchs na lang.
Anyway. I'm wondering what's going on because what I heard, like I talked to some friends from some important international financial institution. I'm not gonna say which, ilan lang naman sila. One of them said, why not green fund? Kung gusto lang nila pilitin nito,
yes,
fine. But make it about renewable energy, something like that, or something like that.
Or climate financing, climate mitigation. Blue economy. Yung mga ganon.
Because Maharlika talaga, pinipilit talaga Maharlika talaga eh. Which is like it's not the best branding internationally, right? Like I'm just saying, yun lang. Why not just National Sovereign Wealth Fund or something like that? Diba? Kasi pinipilit nila gawin yung katulad ng Singapore na may pagka-indigenous. Singapore did not have, what I'm saying, kleptocratic, next level, crony capitalism, whatever. But anyway, so what is the next step? So you're saying, panoorin natin yung susunod na kabanata, which is yung lalabas items sa budget. Panoorin natin yung IRR. Maybe contestation. Some are mentioning here dito sa... By the way, super good comments. People are super happy with this discussion. 2 oras na tayo. But we needed something like this because puro na lang Maharlika Fund, mainit ngayon, pag-usapan na natin Maharlika Fund. But wait lang, let's just rewind at least to Arroyo era, which we did here. I'm so happy about it, and thank you for bearing with me with all these questions because, you know, I want people to find fiscal discussion sexy enough, right, to have interest in it. And thank you to Budget Babe for doing that. Okay, so that's it. What else should we watch here?
Yan. So, syempre, of course, we need to monitor, at least those who can at this point in time, monitor rin na the fiscal numbers, yung debt, yung revenues, yung spending, tuloy-tuloy dapat yan. And yun nga, may tweet ako early this week rin, na when we talk about that, we can't just talk about aggregate levels forever, na it's record high. It will always be record high because aggregate yun aggregate amount yun, and there's a program level. And then siguro after the budget, syempre the other thing bukod dun sa capitalization, and I don't know if they will also put a budget on top of the 50 billion for like actually setting up the entity, kasi 'di ba parang operations niya, yung mga tao na i-hire, that's a different host of issues din na I feel that based on the law, rin siya, napaka highly discretionary din. Kasi for one, the hiring of technical services, like yung mga fund managers, investment, whatever, consultants, even foreign consultants, they're going to be exempt from the procurement law. So that makes it very highly discretionary.
And therefore susceptible to,
abuse.
Yeah. So what yung sinasabi na safeguards ng Senado, whatever, for you, it's nowhere close to that?
I'm not parang the way I see it is, given all of the provisions, like yun, you may exemption sa procurement law in hiring the consulting services. And remember, this is an entity that's not going to implement infra projects. So ano competitive bidding yan? Janitorial services, security guards, di ba? Parang what needs to go through competitive bidding to ensure the independence of the entity from political discretion and political abuse is making that bidding process competitive. Hindi What's worse is, syempre usapan na yung magkano yung sweldo nila kasi syempre may cap lang. I think it's also exempt from some well, it's definitely not going
na tayo sa fund din. Biglang na tayo.
Malaki
next dito. Zara Budget Babe, consultant for Charva Chenes inside the Maharlika Charva Chenes.
Ayun. Aside from that, allowed then yung secondment. So if, for example, ako si president and CEO. I know someone from BSP, for example, kasi GFIs daw, BSP or maybe SEC. Pwede ko siyang pwedeng secondment, meaning i-appoint doon yung tao. So of course, that's not exactly an independent that's not exactly a politically inflated process.
Bahala mo yung bata natin dyan.
Diba? So parang it opens it up to that. Ano pa ba yung ibang nakita ko? The other most alarming for me is the provision also that says kapag nagkulang si fund, when the advisory board thinks they need additional appropriation, they're just going to request from Congress, and Congress will legislate. So basically, you think
bottomless iced tea.
Yes, exactly. So you take all of these things together, and I think it enables more than prevents political discretion in an entity which Rico keeps saying should be independent, diba? Tapos si Senator Gatchalian kahapon, he said there were a lot of safeguards. True enough, 3 pages now, 2 pages of safeguards. Pero ang sa akin dun, it's post facto eh. You're not preventing it. You're actually enabling it by writing the law that way. You're opening it up to abuse and you're just gonna correct it. Hindi ba dapat yung approach preventive? Because this is risky business,
Right.
diba? We're talking about public funds. So ganun, parang ang basa ko dun sa law, ganun yung approach niya. Mas marami siyang provisions that allow exemptions. And then let's just, if pumalya, edi prosecute, ikulong, ganyan. May stiff
Right.
penalty. The penalty for someone who committed, I don't know, fraud or any crime doon sa,
So
ano,
reactive lang
it's
siya.
8 years lang and permanent ban on holding government.
Sobrang
Sobrang
lenient. Sobrang
higit,
lenient,
higit, yes.
reactive. Yeah. Which is not enough. It's not preventative in any
Exactly. And you have a justice system that's the way it is in the Philippines. What's the disincentive?
I mean, we have a junior now, right? Anyway, having
Yun.
said all of that,
Mm-mm.
what gives you, what is the animating spirit behind your advocacy? What gives you hope, and what are the things you're looking at? Because of course, kanina we were discussing about, I think we need some sort of like, because in the US now, the progressive economists, etc., Stiglitz, they create a new Roosevelt Institute or something like that, and they have a lot of very smart people contributing to that, to really cutting edge, progressive, but still objective, science based economic policy, etc. Maybe this is perhaps what we need in the Philippines, is that, because it's one thing to, it's great that we're all doing our own public education campaigns, but I think there should be a brain trust, down the road, because I think already, you, JC, and Rico, all of us, we're doing, we may not agree sometimes, we may have some bardagulan here and there, but I think all of us, we're a symptom, right, of lack of really a serious policy clearinghouse for these issues. Because no offense to the other think tanks which are there, but I think they're catering to old needs, traditional needs, but I think we really need something else, right? Down the road. Because it's one thing to criticize anong kulang sa Maharlika Fund, but at some point we have to be ambitious, right? We are no longer just a poor third world country. We're an emerging market. Soon we could be an upper middle income country. So I think we have to seize the future, right, and have ideas about it. But before even talking about it, what's your animating spirit? What gives you this push and energy to do what you're doing?
I think kasi on the issue of public budget and public finance, like I would say, compared to when I was in government, medyo may inroads naman na, especially because I have former colleagues then who were in government, who's now in civil society, and we're trying very hard, working very hard to mainstream this. Meron namang I would say may interest naman, especially among young people. So that kind of keeps me going. And there are also allies in the media who also want to report fairly, more in depth, and more nuanced analysis. So yeah, medyo yun, kailangan ng tulong talaga. But on a societal level, definitely kailangan kailangan mag-organize around. I was just talking to a friend about this. This is essentially the democratic project of our generation, 'di ba? Na ito yung mga issues natin eh. So yung iba-ibang sectors of society, kailangan natin mag-usap-usap. And I think it has to be deliberate consensus building, because how else are we going to check on the power of the state, 'di ba? If sabog, 'di ba? It is organized yung
Right.
civil society mo. So some amount of of collaboration, definitely, to kailangan ng countervailing force, syempre, 'di ba?
For me, I'm even more basic than for me. I just think we are yet to build a culture of proper public policy, I'm very familiar with the DC think tank culture, right? Or even think, or you go to for how many so like kulang talagang Pilipinas. So I think it's a 1 and 2 was about really general principles of what we want for democracy, but now it's time really for details, because the devil is in the details. how are you going to create a more inclusive development? That's a policy issue, right? How are you going to bring about accountability? It's not just a moral issue, it's a policy issue. I think the problem, kasi usually we just moralize things, or worse, we just make it about Filipino culture. Nasa kultura natin. That's the biggest nonsense I've heard, right? Have you seen Filipinos in Canada, Australia? They're among the most successful, law-abiding people. It has nothing to do with our race and culture. It's about our institutional design and configuration. And you're not going to fix that with just pa-cute TikToks or pa-cute statements. We need real policy packages, right? And to advocate for that, really. So where am I coming from, Suzara? Because 10 years ago, no one knew about really the West Philippine Sea issue. In fact, the term West Philippine Sea really came into being, 2011, 2012, right? So, but so now it's a household issue. Like I can go literally anywhere in the Philippines and I can talk about West Philippine Sea to anyone. So that gave me hope. Not that West Philippine Sea discussion are anywhere close to where it should be. I mean, just ask the Tatay people and the things they say that make me kind of happy. But at least ang laki nung agwate. So we went from vacuum to contestation to, I think, increased intelligent discussion. My sense the same should apply to also macro policy. For the Philippines, it's soon going to be a full-fledged middle-income country. We're not poor country. Hindi tayo poor country, hindi tayo small country. We're going to be among the 30 biggest economies soon. So para sa akin, isa siyang hamon, isa rin siyang opportunity for us to do our share for our own generation. And I'm very glad there are people with very diverse background. You as a development person, JC and Enrico as economist persons, me from my own political science, international affairs background. Like, I think all of us are just contributing to the building block of here. And I'm glad to see many people showing a lot of love and support in the comment section when, in theory, this is among the most boring conversations we have, right? But it's not, because I think people appreciate how big this issue is. So, maraming salamat sa Maharlika Fund. Fund fiscal issue are sexy and interesting. So, thank you so much, Budget Babe. Are there some closing remarks? Because lampas na tayo 2 hours, I think, right?
Yeah, 1 hour lang tayo.
Kulang talaga siya. But I'm glad. I think this was belated. We should have done this earlier, but better late than never. But I look forward to more discussion. Hopefully, in the studio in the future, we can have more and more discussion and itemized talagang discussion. Thank you so much for that. Any closing remarks, Suzara?
Yeah. Well, for me, I always say this naman whenever I give lectures or talks. Just take an interest in the budget. Don't be intimidated by it. Subukan nyo lang tingnan yung numero. Kasi yung numero nun, don't forget, that's your tax money. So, hindi tayo disinterested dyan. The second...
Pinaghirapan natin yan.
The second point na I also want to share is yung budget, kasi we always think about it as numbers lang, numbers game lang. Kaya tayo nai-intimidate diyan. But actually, this is not original to me. Sa DBM to. Lagi sasabi ng mga nasa DBM, whether alumni ng DBM or current civil
veterans.
Yeah. May kwento sa bawat kwenta. So, yung numero nakikita ninyo, napakadaling malaman ng kwento kung i-relate ninyo sa nakikita niyo sa araw-araw na buhay ng mga tao. For example, yung pandemic, kulang ng let's say vaccine. Nahuli tayo. Ang mahal-mahal ng face mask sa government. Bakit? Kasi may pharmacy scandal. So you need to take an interest in the budget kasi this is the summary of the entire government's operations. So kung interesado ka, it doesn't have to be macro na kailangan alam mo lahat. At least yung doon sa purview ng araw-araw mong pamumuhay. Maging you need to be informed. Kasi that's like again, excuse again the metaphor, but I use this para lang maintindihan, just to laymanize. Kapag may pera ka na pinatago mo sa ibang tao, hindi ka disinterested. Ganun yung budget. Essentially, pinagamit mo sa government para may babalik sa'yo na public service, public good. So, hindi pwedeng lang pakibala kayo dyan. Hindi pwedeng ganun. So, yun, just those things kung bakit kailangan we remain interested in it. And I guess for fellow analysts then, and maybe the media, the budget for me is the language of consensus. We can disagree politically, but the numbers are the numbers. Kung ano yung issue na kailangan i-address, dapat doon natin nakikita sa budget. Kahit ano pa yung natin, political color natin, yung budget, numero yan, yun yung yun yung
I mean,
pinaka
it's a matter of life and death. It's a matter of future for our country. It's a matter of our blood, sweat. That because it's our tax money. Ito yung kaban ng bayan, no? So yeah, it's almost that, so you're absolutely right. Don't allow other people to mystify it by making it technocratic. It's a fundamentally political issue because it's about the future of our country and it's about our contribution to the society. As simple as that. So sa una lang siguro it might seem intimidating pero wag tayong magkaloko dyan, diba? This is and it's not even rocket science, right? But it's important. It's important because you have to pay attention to it. And gladly we have people like you. So yeah, please follow Budget Babe, aka Suzara Nadine Suzara. All right. So it works the other way now. Like your name is now Budget Babe, aka Suzara. Thank you so much, Suzara. I hope I didn't tire you too much.
No, okay lang.
I hope I didn't kulit you too much. I just wanted to extract the most out of you because I think you have so much to offer because of your experience, because of knowledge, because of your passion. And I can vouch for it. I know you're a person who truly cares about the country, etc. And definitely you're not as bardagulan as you are on Twitter. So whatever the personality is, tuloy mo lang yan. Laban lang. And I could see everyone's saying here, laban lang, support kay Budget Babe. Just continue to do that. For me, yeah, there was a vacuum, but I'm glad that people like you are filling it up. And for me, I think this is God willing, inshallah, this is just the beginning. And I look forward to more discussion with you and our good friends. And yeah, we may have agreements, disagreements here and there, but at the end of the day, I think we all share very similar objectives here, which is informed public policy discussion because yung future ng ating bayan ang nakasalalay dito. Thank you so much, Suzara. God bless and thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hopefully, studio na tayo next, All right. Para magbigay ako ng Jollibee natin dyan. Gawa tayo ng fund natin. Thank you so much.
Bye. Good night. Good night, everyone.
Isang screenshot tayo.
Sige.
1, 2. Thank you. God bless. Talk